The youngest brother of Barry, Robin and Morris Gibb, better known as the world's most successful musical trio, the Bee Gees.
And it's me you need to show. How deep is your love?
Andy catapulted to fame as a solo artist in the late 70s with 3 chart-topping singles.
I watch you laying in the love I have to bring. I'll do anything to be your everything.
Sadly, his downfall was equally as swift as his rise to the top, with substance abuse issues and depression ravaging his health, passing away in 1988.
And tomorrow, if I'm here without your love, you know I can't survive.
34 years after his death, his story is the subject of a new biography celebrating his life and legacy. And the author of Arrow Through the Heart, Matthew Hill, joins us now from Georgia in the US. Matthew, great to have your insight this morning. What attracted you to the subject of Andy Gibb?
Well, there's been a revival of interest in the Bee Gees in recent years, not that it ever really went away, but there was that documentary about 2 years ago called How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? That was very well received, and now a biopic is being made of the Bee Gees. And there's never been a book on Andy in all this time, and I just thought that's incredible for all the impact and influence Andy had, even in his short career and short life. Somebody really ought to try to tell his story while a lot of the key players are still here to tell it.
US audiences really adored him, didn't they? From tours to starring in musicals and hosting a TV show. But his heart was always in Australia, wasn't it?
And the sad thing was, once he really hit big in the US, he didn't make it back anymore. He was always talking about it, and in fact, in 1983, he appeared on the Mike Walsh show from a studio in LA saying, I'm coming back to Australia after the new year, but it never happened. Even right before he died in 1988, he was still planning on coming to Australia in the fall of that year, but of course he died in March, and so tragically it didn't happen.
And it's such a tragic story too. He was such a huge star for that brief shining period of time. He loved his older brother Barry. How much of an influence did Barry have on Andy's career?
Oh, enormous. In fact, in 1981, Andy appeared on the John Davidson Show, a U.S. talk show. It was that same show, in fact, on which he met Victoria Principal. But anyway, Andy told John Davidson, in his words, that he felt he owed his success chiefly to Barry for Barry's big role in writing and producing his hit records.
You mentioned there his relationship with Victoria Principal. How much of a toll did that breakup have on him?
Sadly, a very substantial one. In interviews for the rest of his life, this topic would often come up. Now, sometimes the interviewer would bring it up, but sometimes Andy would bring it up, and you can just tell watching these interviews, the heartbreak all pouring out of him again and again, right up until his last interview, just weeks before he died.
Oh, it's so sad, isn't it? I mean, his family as well kept trying to push Andy to get back to rehab. What did you learn about his substance abuse?
Well, I think the substance abuse really played, unfortunately, a big role in the demise of his career and the demise of his health, too, of course. He did go into rehab in California in both 1985 and 1986. And the second time, he did kick his cocaine habit, but unfortunately by then, his career was more or less in shambles and he was broke, and again, he had done real damage to his heart. I found out in researching the book and talking to friends of his, the hospitalizations for heart problems began as early as early 1978.
Wow.
Wow. So throughout this process then of writing this book, how did your perception of Andy evolve and change throughout the research?
Well, obviously I had respect for him as a talent in the first place, or I wouldn't have done the book, but what really surprised me the most was the number of musicians who I talked to who worked with Andy, and some who worked with Andy and his brothers said that they thought that Andy was every bit as talented as any of the Bee Gees, and probably even the best singer of the 4 brothers. And Olivia Newton-John told me that she thought that in terms of everything, looks, talent, charisma, that Andy was right up there with any of the Bee Gees. So hopefully the book kind of helps drive that point home to people, because I think that there is this perception of he was the Bee Gees kind of tag-along kid brother. But I think in terms of his talent and his brief impact, he was right up there with any of his brothers.
Matthew, it's a great insight. We really do appreciate your time this morning. And you can purchase a copy of that book, Arrow Through the Heart. It's online now. Coming up in the news at